Now, of course, member states have to act individually, but collectively as well. They have to be supported, of course, by the right kinds of partnerships at the national, regional, and international levels. The strategic leadership role of the United Nations here obviously is quintessential. A former UN High Commissioner for Refugees, a former Prime Minister of Portugal, and possibly a future, many would say hopefully a future Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, is with us, and he is ideally placed to look at this issue from all these different various vantage points. Mr. Guterres, how do you see the challenge of providing higher education in emergencies?
You are really addressing a gap, a real gap, that is unfair for the aspirations of people, that is undermining the possibilities of reconstruction of countries, and that is also dangerous for the international community. Now, you will face many difficulties in implementing this declaration. The prevailing mood still is that a narrow approach to life-saving should prevail in emergency response. And it will be necessary to explain that this mood is wrong, and this mood should be corrected. There are, of course, many important initiatives already on the ground. I remember the Education Above All of Sheikh Moza. I would recall the Education Summit last year convened in Norway to put education in the agenda of humanitarian action. And of course, President Sampaio's initiative on the higher education for Syrian refugees, involving today 35 universities in 10 countries. But the truth is that if one looks at the investment in education in emergency situations compared with the global expenditure of those situations, we are still talking a very, very small percentage. And if one looks at the impact of it, namely in relation to refugee situations, the truth is that in the operations handled by UNHCR, and Volker Turk will correct me if I'm already, out of the more actual information, but around 50% only of children had access to primary education, less than 1/3 to secondary education, and as it was said, 1% to higher education. This shows really how neglected education has been in the priorities of fundraising and fund mobilization in humanitarian aid. Now, I must say, having been in many emergency situations, I understand, even for people on the ground, if you are in the border between South Sudan and Ethiopia and see tens of thousands of people coming in 1 month, hundreds of thousands in 1 year, you feel that what we need is to move the trucks, to pitch the tents, to find the water, distribute the food, vaccinate the children. But the point is that this logic is now becoming outdated for 2 reasons. First, because the logic that existed before, separating emergency situations from protracted situations, no longer makes sense. What we are having now is protracted emergencies. Situations that have the characteristics of an emergency, but that last for years and years and years without any meaningful change in the needs of humanitarian response. And second, because the idea that in responding to a crisis, humanitarians come first, address the humanitarian problems, and then as the situation stabilizes, they will tend to move out and the development actors come in order to ensure reconstruction and stabilization. This again is no longer a reality. Now we have situations in which from the beginning it's absolutely essential to have development actors. We can no longer separate humanitarian aid from development cooperation. And if that is the case, education that some might neglect in a narrow-minded approach to life-saving in emergencies, education is the central pillar of any development project.
You mentioned that the old logic of putting first life-saving emergencies, essentially giving shelter, food, water, security as well to refugees, no longer has to be taken separately from the overall issue of education as well, which goes towards the rebuilding and reconstruction of these war-torn countries. How how realistic, though, how practical is this viewpoint? Because higher education requires some kind of predictability, some kind of rather complex sets of infrastructure. How do you square this off with the unpredictability of refugee crises and the flow of refugees?
Things are unpredictable, but there is one thing that we can predict, is that crisis will last. I mean, if you look at the crisis we are facing today, Syria, it has been there for 5 years, and it will go on, probably. Afghanistan, it has been there for, I would say, yes, but I mean, since the 70s, 40 or 50 years. Somalia, more than 20 years. Democratic Republic of Congo, more than 20 years. And you can go on and on and on. So, crises will last. And recoveries will be slow. If that is the case, not to have education since the beginning as a priority and not to include higher education in that approach, that global approach to education, is, I think, a suicide. And what we are seeing in some of the situations I lived with in UNHCR is an enormous frustration of young people that stay in refugee camps for years and years and years and have no chance either to complete their education or to find a job or any other form of integration in the society. This kind of ghettification of young people in today's world in protracted emergencies is, I think, something totally unacceptable from their point of view, but it's also, I think, a danger for us all.
And I think the key here is to secure the funding, though, for these types of endeavors. Now, if the influx into the EU provoked such a political dissent last year and political divisions among EU member states, how can we really expect EU governments or others, wealthy governments, to devote enough attention, let alone enough resources, to bring higher education to refugees? And I was struck by a statement you made last year in Washington, where you said that the refugee problem has not become all of a sudden more dramatic. And I quote, "What has changed is that refugees for the first time are coming in big numbers to the rich world, and that there is that false idea, you say, in Europe, that it is being invaded." I mean, how do you counter, how do you change this narrative in order to make everything that we're talking about here today happen?
Well, I think, first of all, there are things that are a matter of fact. We had last year in Europe about a little bit more than 1 million people coming by the sea, not all refugees. Many were migrants also aspiring to come into Europe. If you compare 1 million with the population of the European Union, we are talking about less than 2%. Now, in Lebanon, we have 1 refugee for each 3 Lebanese. So, let's be clear. We are talking about a problem that is serious, whose dimension is big, but it should be manageable if the European Union would be able, together with member states, to organize themselves in order to, first of all, prevent, to the extent possible, this kind of movement, and that has to do with peace negotiations in Syria, that has to do to the support to the countries of first asylum, to many other things that are not being done sufficiently. But then, when a flow comes in, to organize the reception, the registration, the screening, and the distribution in a, I would say, acceptable way and fair way in relation to all European countries. If a country like mine, Portugal, would receive proportionally to our dimension, our economy and our population, it would mean receiving 20 to 30,000 people. This would be perfectly manageable for a country like Portugal. But instead of this kind of organized reception, screening, distribution, what we had was this movement across the Balkans, looking like something that nobody was in charge, nobody was able to control, and that many felt that was a kind of invasion that would undermine I would say, the identity of their societies or whatever. So it is true, in my opinion, that this could have been managed, and this we shouldn't be having today the impact that we had in many public opinions that are now totally against refugees, migrants, foreigners, etc. But having said so, there is one thing that is clear. If some countries in the north do think that they cannot receive a large number of refugees, then there is no other way but to massively invest in first of all, addressing the crisis to solve them, and second, supporting effectively the countries of first asylum, namely allowing them to not only guarantee to the refugees but also to host communities the access to education, to health, to jobs, to many other aspects that will allow people to live in harmony and not to feel forced to move onwards in order to guarantee the minimum to which they aspire in life. What we cannot have is closed borders and no dramatic increase in development cooperation and humanitarian aid to the areas in crisis.
And following up on this thought, and as Minister Musalis mentioned earlier, should countries, universities in certain countries take specific measures perhaps in offering a number of scholarships per year for qualified refugees? What are your thoughts on that?
There are already several initiatives in relation to this. There is a program sponsored by Germany, the DAFI program, which corresponds to this 1% that I have mentioned, but of course it's 1%. There is the initiative that I also mentioned, in which 35 universities are now receiving Syrian refugees. I think this should be a common practice, and there should be student visas easily given to make it happen in a I would say, normal way. And governments, together with universities and the civil societies, should organize themselves in order to guarantee that those that are a vital component of these moving communities that are facing this crisis could have the expression of international solidarity that would allow them to, as I said, feel themselves fulfilled in their aspirations, but at the same time to be able to contribute in the future for their countries, and also not to feel the enormous frustration of being abandoned when the motto of the international community is not to leave anyone behind.
But just briefly, in order to have a more coherent approach, should UN agencies, specialized agencies, perhaps UNESCO, UNHCR, set up a specific fund to help students in these cases?
I think that the problem is not to have a fund, because sometimes you have a fund and then the fund is unfunded and then you don't solve the problem. I think the problem is to establish mechanisms of coordination between all the actors. Governments, host governments of countries of origin whenever that is meaningful, but host countries and governments in donor countries, UN agencies, the civil society. There are several NGOs that have played a crucial role in education, and that, of course, should be recognized and should be promoted, universities, and to try to have a concerted action, and then to make sure that those programs would be adequately funded.
And we will, forgive me to interrupt you, we'll be hearing from these NGOs in a few minutes, but perhaps just ending on this note, you mentioned earlier in the European context, but in the wider context as well, that governments should come together to prevent crises in the first place. So I wonder, as a prospective Secretary General of the UN yourself, do you think, and I must ask you this, do you think that the dramatic increase of refugees and IDPs around the world has to do, to a certain extent, with the failure of the UN, the Security Council, to prevent and address some of these crises in the first instance?
I'd like first to clarify that I'm strictly here in my capacity of former High Commissioner for Refugees.
But would you say that the UN can do more, though?
Portuguese delegation. But I would like to say one thing about this, and that is, I feel, clear. The international community has spent much more resources, time, and energy in managing crises than in preventing them. And prevention is something that is very difficult to put in place. First of all, because there is no attention to prevention. There are no cameras filming when a crisis is prevented. The cameras are there when the crisis erupts. And so there is funding to respond to the crisis, but sometimes there is no funding for those programs that are necessary in order to guarantee that society is developed in a way that is harmonious, that is fair, and that avoids this kind of situations. But one of the things that I believe needs to dramatically change in the priorities of the international community is the focus on prevention. And it's not only prevention of crisis. It is prevention also, and I'm very happy with the Paris Agreement, in relation to moving into preventing climate change to become an engine of tragedies, one after the other, is the prevention in all other aspects related to peace, security, development, human rights, in which a concerted effort in prevention can be, first of all, a huge source of stability for us all, of development for the world, but also it is much cheaper to prevent than to respond to this dramatic crisis. For those that selfishly look only at the material dimension of things, it's really better to prevent than to respond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guterres, and many thanks again to all of our distinguished speakers in this opening session. Our next segment now looks at the rapid response mechanism for higher education in emergencies to make sure that this whole process is dealt with efficiently from the very beginning.